You never asked me for anything, and that simplicity made me realize how heavy all my past connections truly were. You never asked me for anything, and somehow that made me want to hand you the parts of my heart I kept locked away. You never asked me for anything, and I didn't understand how someone could love without conditions until I met you. You never asked me for anything. And that is what made me notice how deeply you cared, without ever saying a word. You never asked me for anything, and your quiet love felt more genuine than all the loud promises I'd ever heard. You never asked me for anything, but you were always there, and that presence felt more valuable than anything I could have given. You never asked me for anything, and that's why I wanted to give you more than I've ever given anyone. You never asked me for anything, yet you understood me in ways people who demanded everything never did. You never asked me for anything, and that's why I knew your heart was rare, because you loved without taking. You never asked me for anything, and your patience taught me that real love doesn't rush, it reassures. You never asked me for anything, and your kindness still echoes in me whenever I feel lost. You never asked me for anything, but you saw my pain without me having to explain it. You never asked me for anything, and that made you the only person who made me feel safe without trying. You never asked me for anything, yet you carried pieces of me I never verbalized just because you cared enough to notice. You never asked me for anything, and that's the reason I still think of you when my heart feels tired. You never asked me for anything, and somehow you became the calm I didn't know how to ask for. You never asked me for anything, and you taught me that love that doesn't demand is the one that lasts the longest. You never asked me for anything, and because of that, I learned how to love without fear. You never asked me for anything, and your silence felt like a warm place where my wounds could breathe. You never asked me for anything, yet you held space for me in ways people demanding everything never could. You never asked me for anything, and it still amazes me how someone so gentle could have such a strong impact on me. You never asked me for anything, and your loyalty came without pressure, just genuine care. You never asked me for anything, and somehow that made me trust you more than I trusted myself. You never asked me for anything, and the purity of that feels rare in a world full of expectations. You never asked me for anything, and I didn't know how much I needed that freedom until I met you. You never asked me for anything, and still, you gave me things I didn't even know how to articulate. You never asked me for anything, and your presence became a safe harbor after years of storms. You never asked me for anything, and that made me wonder how someone could love so selflessly. You never asked me for anything, but you cared in ways that felt louder than any request ever could. You never asked me for anything, and somehow you stayed even when I had nothing to offer. You never asked me for anything, and that's what made our connection feel real, because it wasn't built on needs, but on truth. You never asked me for anything, and that quiet loyalty became the foundation I didn't know I needed. You never asked me for anything, yet you showed up for me every time without hesitation. You never asked me for anything, and that's how I realized your love was a gift, not a bargain. You never asked me for anything, and because of that, I finally learned what it means to be accepted. You never asked me for anything, and your love felt like a soft whisper in a world full of demands. You never asked me for anything, and I still struggle to understand how someone so selfless found their way into my life. You never asked me for anything, and even now, you remain the gentle memory I hold on to when the world turns harsh. You never asked me for anything, but you gave me strength in moments I didn't have the courage to ask for help. You never asked me for anything, and your patience healed parts of me I never spoke about. You never asked me for anything, and the honesty of that still comforts me when I feel overwhelmed. You never asked me for anything, and your absence now feels heavier because I knew your intentions were always pure. You never asked me for anything, and that's what made me realize you loved my soul, not my usefulness. You never asked me for anything, and that softness is something I still search for in everyone I meet. You never asked me for anything, and that made me love you without even noticing when it happened. You never asked me for anything, and your understanding of me felt deeper than my own. You never asked me for anything, but you cared enough to stay. Even when I pushed everyone else away. You never asked me for anything. You were the first person who truly didn't expect a thing from me. And maybe that's why you became the only one I wanted to give everything to. You never asked me for anything, and that silence made me realize how rare you are. Because everyone else wanted something from me, except the one heart I wanted to give the most to. You never asked me for anything. You were the first person who didn't try to take from me, and that's exactly why I trusted you without even noticing. You never asked me for anything, and somehow that was louder than every demand I've ever heard, because it showed me love doesn't always take. Sometimes it simply stays. You never asked me for anything, and I didn't understand it at first. But now I see it was your way of showing me I was enough even before I offered anything. You never asked me for anything, but you gave me peace. And maybe that's the one thing I didn't know I was starving for. You never asked me for anything, and that's how I knew your presence wasn't a transaction. It was a choice. A genuine, gentle choice. You never asked me for anything. You were the first person who didn't try to measure my worth by what I could give, but by who I was when I thought no one was looking. You never asked me for anything. And that strange, beautiful freedom made me fall deeper than I ever planned to. You never asked me for anything. Even when you had every reason to, and that's when I realized you weren't here to use me. You were here to understand me. You never asked me for anything, and I think that's why losing you feels like losing the safest place I ever found. You never asked me for anything, but you somehow taught me everything about what love should feel like. Quiet, steady, and real. You never asked me for anything. And I didn't know people like you existed. People who love without taking, without expecting, without forcing. You never asked me for anything. And maybe that's why I wanted to give you the parts of me I thought no one deserved. You never asked me for anything, but you gave me comfort in ways I didn't even know how to ask for. You never asked me for anything, and it terrified me because I wasn't used to being loved without conditions, without pressure, without fear. You never asked me for anything, and the simplicity of that broke me in places I didn't know needed healing. You never asked me for anything, And it made me wonder if anyone else would ever see me the way you did, without wanting to change me. You never asked me for anything, at least not out loud, yet your quiet presence taught me more about love than all the loud promises I've ever heard. You never asked me for anything, but still, you were the one person I always felt the urge to give my best to. You never asked me for anything, and your silence became the safest space my heart had ever stepped into. You never asked me for anything, and that's why I offered you everything, even the parts of me that never felt safe with anyone else. You never asked me for anything, and maybe that's why I trusted you with the sides of me I usually hide. You never asked me for anything, and that made your presence feel like a soft place to land after years of falling. You never asked me for anything, but you gave me something priceless: peace, stability, and the freedom to be myself. You never asked me for anything, and your love became the quiet reassurance I didn't know I needed. You never asked me for anything, and that made me realize how many people only stayed as long as I kept giving. You never asked me for anything, and it felt strange at first, but eventually it felt like breathing, natural, effortless, healing. You never asked me for anything, and I don't know if I'll ever meet someone who understands love the way you did. You never asked me for anything, not attention, not validation, not sacrifice, just my presence, Huyen. And even that you received with gratitude. You never asked me for anything, and that humility made me fall for you in ways I can't put into words. You never asked me for anything, and that's why every memory of you still feels pure, untouched by expectations. You never asked me for anything, and maybe that's what scares me the most, because love like that is rare and impossible to forget. You never asked me for anything. And for the first time in my life, I felt like I wasn't being drained. I was being seen. You never asked me for anything, and that made me realize you truly cared. Not for what I gave, but for who I was. You never asked me for anything, and because of that, I never had to pretend or perform for you. You never asked me for anything, and your quiet kindness became the loudest proof that love doesn't have to hurt. You never asked me for anything, and that's why I still think of you when my soul feels tired. You were my calm.